G'day everyone and welcome back to the shed. Today I'm looking at my floor that I've made for my white HG ute, and it's been a little bit of an evolution. This is the third attempt I've had at making a floor. Now, I've made floors in the past for these cars and they've turned out okay. And by okay I mean they have the appearance of the original. I've never actually taken one all the way up to the firewall seam before. Usually I've joined them across through here, and I've made a reasonable representation of what the factory made, but if you looked at them closely you would see it was an obvious reproduction. This time I've made a floor that actually is very close to what the factory gave us, and it was a lot of investigating, a lot of mucking around with tooling to actually get it to work in the end. So we've got a lot of little things we've got to look at. We've got the bead lines, which I did on the pull max for this front half here. Previously I've done them on the bead roller, and I had a set of rollers that was accurate to the shape, but with the bead roller you're working on the springiness of the metal, so when you roll it through quite often it will return to a shape other than what the roller was once you start building tension into your panel. So when you've got a panel that's got lines this way, lines that way and multiples thereof, you're going to have quite a bit of tension pulled into these sheets by what you're doing. The other problem I was getting with the bead roller, and I've had a similar problem here, I've actually split this and had to weld it up, but as the bead roller was running around this corner here, Isaac Newton again getting in my way and mucking up my projects, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The roller pushing from the bottom was actually bringing this area here back this way as this line was going in the other way. So I was winding up with a loss of curve on the corners at the width of the roller. I was spending a lot of time hammering these back out, and you could see a lot of obvious tool marks in there from where I'd had to work it. So in the end I made a new set of pull max dies and I've run these lines with the pull max, and that's worked well. The other problem I had was at each end of these bead lines there's like a little ramp angle, and I have made a different set of pull max tools to create these ramp angles in here. We've also got where they intersect this line, they actually flow from this line. So it was a unique set of tools to actually create the intersection between the two lines. The other problem I've had is this rear section of the pan just in here. The pull max dies that I'd made to do the front weren't suitable for the back. So I decided this time round to just use the bead roller again and then finish them in the pull max. So we've got pull max marks in there as well as some damage from the rollers from the edge of the tooling that I will have to work out with a hammer and dolly, and as I've welded it in I've got some distortion around these areas here, and I've got to actually pull that out, and that'll all come out with the hammer and dolly, but it's secondary repairs. So I'm thinking if I'm going to make another one I've got to do one for the brown car, and so what I'll do then is I'll make a new lower die for the pull max which will allow me to get the curve this way into it. So that's another little journey to go on there. Now, because I wanted to put this floor in this car and have it look factory from underneath the car when it was finished, it's a matter of choosing where to put the weld. So I had no choice here. It was either run it across this flat area here or run it across here or get it back into this bead line and disguise it there. So I've wound up on this section just running it across this flat, a bit of work with the hammer and dolly and I can get that back accurate. The law tells us in Australia we must do a lap join on a floor pan, we can't butt weld them. So I've got, it varies from 10 to 16 millimetres the lap because I didn't measure it. I just marked around the edge of the sheet and I just cut inside that line. So there is an overlap and I will weld the bottom as well. But on this face through here, I always put my joins into the corner, and you can see up the top here, there's the two welds. I've actually welded the bottom from this edge here. That will hammer up and that will grind nicely on the other side so that that will disappear into the car. This area through here where it's got this bit on the side of the transmission hump for the gear shifter linkages, same thing, it is joining on the bottom of that corner and it will grind and disappear. We've got this little area here right on the edge of the curve. If the sheet had been a little bit wider we could have disappeared it completely, but there will be just a little feather on the edge there once it is finished that you will see. I am thinking nothing more than spray polyester and that would fill that, a few coats of high build primer. I'm not really worried about anything like that. This is the easy one. It's between two curves. We can radius the grinding on the bottom and we can get that all to disappear nicely. The rest of it's just going to be a little bit of tidy up work with the hammer and dolly. So overall I'm really happy with it. Now the inside finish, I'm not worried about there being a visible weld because the floor coverings cover it up. If you go for licensing on any of these cars and a vehicle examiner wants to see your welding, you can lift the floor covering up, he can see where you've welded, even if it's ground off smooth. If there's lumps of sanded body filler in there and he suspects you might have covered up a dodgy weld, he can insist on you stripping that away and showing what you've got underneath it. So I'm not going to finish it any more than just grind it off and paint it, and that'll be fine for the inside of the car. So I think now we'll have a bit of a close-up look at some of these features on the panel, and then we'll look at some of the tooling that made it. Now this is the first pan I made, and once again it would work in a car, and a mate of mine actually wants it to put in his own car, and that's fine. This one, if you looked at this one in the car, it would be an obvious reproduction. None of these intersections here are very nice on it. The lines are okay. I made these bead lines across here with this set of tools here. I originally made this set of tools to do a floor pan for a Morris Oxford, and it was very close to the Holden, so I have done a few of these sections of floor pans over the years with this set of tools, but the bead line's just a little bit narrow to what the factory had it, so I've made a new set to replace this set. The way I make tooling has evolved a little bit since I made that previous set. This set here works a whole lot better, and it does a very neat bead line across here, but you do wind up with a rounded end on it rather than a squared off one. So I've made another set of tools to work in conjunction with these. This set allows me to do intersections as well. So what I've got on the lower post is a cutaway on each side, and I've got a wide strip for the top post. So it actually goes through, but it overlaps the area that the bead line runs through. So for doing a straight line, there's no worries. You get a nice straight line all the way through there, and you come up to a reasonably square end just with the sheet supported on there, and that makes that by itself fairly well. But where we come up to an intersection, we have the post underneath the sheet. The angle lines up with the angle of the bead line. This runs in across the top, and that gives us a neat flow in to this bead line in here. This side of this curved line in here, this is where the cross member fits underneath the car, and it's a box section that comes forward and the subframe bolts to it. And the way it sits in the car, it's a little bit offset. So they've got a shallower bead line on this side to the other side. So I've got a set of tools here to do the deep side, and that works well for there. And I just used this same set of tools for the straight bead line here to do the inside, and that all lines up there fine. We've got this raised up section in the front, and that required a bit of unique tooling. Now I've made a simple press that just pulls up on these 6 bolts, and it's all the pieces necessary to make this, well, it's almost a T shape. Now, the other thing that I learned with this one being the first panel I made, I put it in the car and I'd made everything parallel this edge, because when you sit in the seat of the car and look forward into the footwell, you've got these lines that appear straight. They go straight from the floor and straight up the firewall. But what I didn't take into account is the floor actually runs uphill towards the tunnel in the centre. So this is an uphill ramp across here. So these bead lines and this piece in here are actually offset on a little bit of an angle. So you can see where I've run the straight bead line and then shifted it, and that's another reason why I didn't like this panel. And I actually had 3 goes to get this piece set in the right spot. So there's a lot of tool marks here where I actually worked it and flattened it out and redid it. So once again, I wasn't happy with that, but this panel will work. It could go into a car with no real problems at all. So we've got our basic pieces here. We've got the female piece which sits on this side, and we've got the piece that pushes up from the back and presses inside there, and then there's just a backing plate to support the sheet around it. So once you put that in there, you don't need a lot of tension. You just do that up with a couple of spanners and it just winds up quite easily and it presses this shape in straight away. I did wind up with a little bit of distortion either side in here, but that worked out easily, and even on the finished result panel it didn't have any real dramas in there. Now this is what I was talking about the flattening out effect of the roller from behind. It was actually lifting this area in here, and it was actually quite a steep ramp coming up and a steep ramp running away. It was quite a significant change. So I had to put that in there and sit that on a piece of round bar in the vise and really hammer the back of it to stretch this area here to get it to lift. And then I lost some of the definition on the bead line through there as well. So making the new set of tooling for the Pullmax that I'll show you in a minute overcome that problem altogether. Here's the second one I made. This one I've actually got these lines and this top piece here all in the right spot. Everything lines up. I made one massive mistake. I put this line in the wrong spot. It's a little bit too far out. So I could repair this and turn it into a usable pan. It wouldn't be as pretty, but once again, if you're going to put a bit more effort into hammering it up, it would work all right. The big thing I took from this pan that I didn't like was, as I was working these bead lines, once again, it's impacting on the whole sheet, and there's a whole lot of stresses and things being locked up in it from all this work to it. And I was getting wrinkles through here. Now the factory floor has got a really nice flat area through here, and I wanted to capture that. I didn't want to have it wrinkled up. Now, I've said before, poor old white ute has had a major front end accident at some point in its life. And one of the things that was still evident in the car was this box section had been squashed in a little bit from the impact of the accident. Because it's got this rail underneath the floor that actually holds the subframe, it's where the load came back into the car, so it actually pushed this line back, and this section through here was quite damaged. It was all wrinkled up, it had dropped in there, it had caved from that accident from possibly 1971 or 1972. It was a very young car at the time. I didn't like it from that point of view, so back to the drawing board and rethink the whole idea. I decided to put some clamping plates on this section after I'd run these bead lines. So basically 1/8 3mm plates cut to the shape I wanted to bolt on there, and the bolt holes to hold it to the sheet are the spots where I've put the plug welds in to hold the car together in the end. So these are 2 inches apart, so 50mm apart, and that lines up roughly with where the factory would have put welds in it anyway. There's a couple of 2mm thick pieces of steel in there, 14 gauge, that actually sit in these depressions before it's all clamped together, so that I'm not actually flattening out any of the beadwork that I've done on it. Once again on this sheet, I hadn't actually made the final Pullmax tools, so I don't have a very good flow in between the bead lines and these cross lines there. So that was yet to come from this one. So I've been at this on and off. I haven't had a lot of spare time, and this has been very much a spare time job. So I started the first pan, I looked back on some photos I had back in May. It was the 18th of May, and it's now the 17th of August. Yesterday I welded the third one in there. So it's been a case of do a bit, stop, have a rethink of what you're doing, and then come back to it. And so each one has improved. If I made another one again today, it would be better again than what I've done with the previous one. So I have adapted the tooling to get a better result. Now these are some of the formers I made to keep the sheet in the right shape as it was going through the processes. So this one here was screwed to the outside edge, and I made that by fitting it into the existing car. So I knew it was exactly the shape I wanted when the panel was finished, and that worked well. And once again, the screw holes are where I've put welds in it as well, so they were gone anyway, and it didn't matter for actually drilling those holes in there at that point in time. A shorter one was made to go on the inside because all I needed to do was to support this angle here, and naturally once you start wanting to put a bead line around a corner, it will want to make the sheet back flat again. So These were enough, and these are just a piece of 16 gauge, a bit of 1.6, and a little bit of a right angle bend on them, and that is stiff enough to actually support that while we're doing this work. To run these curved lines through here, I just made a little fence and screwed it to the sheet and then ran the Pullmax tool along the edge of it. So it was just a matter of screwing that to the sheet at the appropriate setting and then sitting that up against the lower die on the Pullmax and just let it track along to get the curved line to run in there. So that works well as well. But on this panel, I wasn't having a good day. I had about 50 goes to get it in the right spot, and once again, by that stage, I was pretty dark on this panel anyway, so I knew it was only going to be an experiment at that point. Now here is the final Pullmax tools that I did for the bead lines. So what I've done is, because I knew I needed more surface area under the sheet, I've made this big wide die for the bottom. The only drama with this one is it won't do the curve the other way. So what I'll do is I will make another one of these, but I will radius it this way so that we can actually get it to run under the sheet and go around this corner and get this line to run to where we want it to. But for doing the curve the other way, it works beautifully. Originally, this tool matched this one. So we're looking at a piece of 1/2 inch thick plate that it was made from, and they matched up like that. But I've added these outside edges onto it and made it into a pyramid shaped tool, and that allowed me to get the nice little ramp angle that runs up to this intersecting bead line the other way, and it does look very factory once it's all in there and done. So I was very happy with that one. It works well. Very happy with this one, and if I make a third tool to run underneath it, it'll work properly for the other end as well. So it's just the evolution of the ideas to get what we wanted at the end of the day. We just had that curl up a little bit because it was just on a short piece of metal for demonstration only, but where it was in the full sheet of the floor, there was none of that curling happened on it. But we get these nice little corners that work in here. It flows into this other piece here. The intersecting lines all work nicely, and they are more or less finished off the Pullmax. A little bit more work with those tools. If you're making an exact tool for the exact angle every time, you'd get perfection on there, but we've just got a tiny little mark there now between the two that we'll just hammer out nicely. So that would leave that more or less ready for primer in there. What I also did on the other ones was used the back of the hammer and just cut a little diagonal, get the angle in there across to the corners, and the same on the other side. And we get a very factory looking triangular end on them that the original bead lines have got. Earlier on I mentioned that a couple of these bead lines tore as I was working through the Pullmax. Now, both cases it was my fault. You do get a degree of work hardening with the steel when you're doing this sort of work, and if your tools are built correctly and you're working within the capability of your sheet, you have no problems at all. But what happened on this bead line here was the first one that tore, was that I hadn't had the Pullmax set correctly. Mine's got an air operated system to actually lower the top tool down to the working position, and it was too deep. When I lowered the air ram into place, it dropped it down, and it dropped this bead line to about half the depth that I wanted in the first pass. And normally I would work up to that. The metal stretches more slowly and it allows us a bit more time to do things. And I thought to myself at the time, it'll be all right because I've got to do more passes. By the time I was ready for the last pass, I started having this little tear appearing in it, and I thought, great, there's the mistake there. Same tooling, no different. Initially it did this bead line here with no problems whatsoever, and I worked from one edge of the sheet across to keep my bead lines accurate. So because the sheet will actually draw in a little bit into these lines, it will change shape. So it's one thing to mark it all out as you go, but you might find that the shrinkage on the sheet will shift these lines marginally between them. So I always work from the one side to get them where I want them. I pressed this bead line with no problems whatsoever. I did these two lines in here, no problems whatsoever, and then I pressed this into here. An observation I had made, because this is quite a deep pressing and it pulled the sheet quite a bit, it flattened this bead line out a little bit in here. Now, Probably not enough to worry about in hindsight, but I could see it and I thought, yeah, I'll just put it back in the Pull Max and run it through there again. But because the metal had work hardened, because it had stretched out, as soon as it started going around the corner, it started to tear it. So one of those things, if I'd left it alone at that point, it would have worked better. If I had pre-stretched some of this beforehand, might have worked better as well. In future, I might put them in the wheeling machine and just wheel a little strip that's going to be in the area of the bead line so that there's a little bit too much metal to start with, and when we start working it with the Pull Max, it'll pull it into the right shape. Because of the clamping plates, I've got this section of the floor nice and flat, it's like the factory, and we've got this little uphill run across here, and it's got a little bit of a depression in here, all matches the factory. Once I took the floor out, this box section that supports the subframe could actually move up and down a bit. And so I was in a bit of a quandary for a while about what to do about that, because I could easily weld a new floor in and have this area a little bit high or a little bit low, and that would muck up the actual mounting points for the subframe to bolt to the car. So what I've done is just welded this piece of steel across the bottom of the car, and by welding I mean just tacked on each side, but we do know that the inner rocker panels are the same height side to side. So from that I could take my combination square and I could measure off the bottom of the steel beam and duplicate the measurement on the passenger side, which it is exactly on the money. And when I first put it together, it wasn't right. We were up by a good 1/4 of an inch, so about 6 millimeters. So I put a block of wood across the floor inside, a screw up jack and another piece of wood supported through the hole in the firewall and across the bottom of the dash. Once I'd put the jack inside, I could actually screw this down. I got it to the right height, and then coincidentally, this side of the floor pan lined up with this piece of the floor that I'd cut away, and the other side lined up with the floor as well. So I knew I was in exactly the right spot. So with the floor at that point and tech screwed in everywhere, I was able to get a nice pencil line along the car to get the fold lines in place. So once I knew I had them, I could take the floor out again and fold this edge across the top and down the side there, and then it was ready to weld in place. Once I put it back in and I started welding it, I was down by 1 millimeter, and I thought, well, that's within spec. We could probably get away with that. Previously, somebody's opened this hole up, so I've got to repair that anyway. So I thought, worst case scenario, I could put the little hole a little bit off center and that would work. But in the end, I thought, what have I got to lose? Block of wood and a sledgehammer. Gave it a whopping great big clout from the bottom, and it moved up, and it lined up exactly. I did have one little fright. I'd got to the point where I was welding the floor in, and I do a lot of checking. I'll get so far and they'll come back and check it again. I also knew that I could weld the perimeter of the floor quite safely, and then if that centre box section was a little bit high or low, I could adjust that before I welded it in. So I reached the point where I'd checked everything and done it over a few times, and then I started welding that centre piece in. It was basically at the point of no return. I checked it, and suddenly I've got a 3/16 of an inch 4 millimeter gap between the combination square and that piece of square tube, and I'm thinking, what is going on here? How can I be out by so much? And I'm trying to think of all the ways I could drop the floor, because it has become solid, a solid structure. And then little man in my head gets going and says, check the other side. I must have dropped the square because the square had bumped out of adjustment. I reset it on the other side. It was exactly the same on this. So little fright, but it was no great problem. Big thank you to all our subscribers. Today we have hit 1966 subscribers. I was born in 1966, so it's a pretty good feeling. Getting a lot of watch minutes, so thank you very much to everybody who's been watching the channel. I'm Rob Teal. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.